Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Pistoia Alliance Debates Webinar. So today our topic for the webinar is going to be benefits and costs of fair implementation for the life sciences industry. I'm Ian Harrow and I'm a project manager for Pistoia Alliance, and I will be the moderator for our expert panel today. And I'm pleased to welcome 4 panelists. I'll tell you a bit more about them soon. The 4 panelists are James Malone from SciBite, Filip Pattyn from OntoForce, Alexandra Grebe Barron, and Drashtti Vasant, both from Bayer. These on this slide are the FAIR guiding principles at a glance. This is just a quick show of the 4 fundamental parts of FAIR. FAIR being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these, of course, are the guiding principles for scientific data management, which were published on back in 2016 by Wilkinson et al, and they are proving to be extremely useful. So I'm not going to dwell on what these principles are, because the subject of today is all about these principles, these guiding principles in practice, their benefits and the cost of implementing them. So here they are, and I'm now moving along from them, and I thought it would be very useful to poll a couple of questions just to understand our audience today. So the first poll question is, where is your workplace? And so I'm now.
Okay, I have launched the poll for you.
Thank you.
We have about 70% voted already so far. We're looking at 45% are technology vendors, 32% are with a biopharmaceutical. We have 11% of other.
Yeah.
That's
9% academics.
Yeah, so if you give me a second, we'll go for 10 more seconds. We've got over 90% voting. Please get your votes in.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Closing the poll. And now I'm sharing the results. You should see a bar graph with the final results.
Excellent. So the majority, over getting towards 80%, is the combination of the workplace being either a biopharmaceutical company or a technology provider, which isn't a big surprise. That's interesting to see. And now we're moving on to the second poll question, which is, how mature is FAIR implementation in your workplace? And there are 5 levels of maturity. So minimal understanding of FAIR guidelines, good understanding but minimal FAIR implementation, and the votes are coming in.
Yeah, okay, so we're about 50%, so we'll let it go for another minute or so. Good understanding, but minimal implementation looks to be winning out here. So this is a very timely event.
Yeah, that's reaching about 50%. About 80% of you have voted so far. Just let it settle down.
Let's get this over 90, and then we'll okay, we'll let it go for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay. So here are the results. So Nearly 50% of the audience have a good understanding of the FAIR principles, but minimal FAIR implementation in their workplace. So, as you say, there are very few who have mature, the total mature FAIR implementation, whether it be selected or systematic, is a total of about less than 20%. So, again, an interesting result. Thank you, everybody, for participating in those two polls. That tells us about our audience. So, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our expert panel. And before I introduce them with this slide, I just would like to remind everybody, as an audience, you have access to be able to enter questions. So I'd encourage you during the course of the webinar to enter your questions as text into the GoToWebinar platform. There's a little text box for that. And also a reminder that this is a recorded webinar. So turning to our expert panel, I'd like to welcome our 4 experts. James is CTO at SciBite, a Semantic Technology company. James, he previously he was a lead ontologist at EmblyBI. He's worked on open targets and EmblyBI's linked data platform. Filip is scientific lead at OntoForce, another semantic technology company, previously a consultant at Manapi Informatics, and he's worked on ICT and bioinformatics. And then there is Alexandra. She's an IT business partner for real evidence at Bayer, and she works closely with scientists across all the functions at Bayer to make data fair for advanced analytics. And Drashtti. She is also an IT business partner for translational sciences at Bayer, currently leading a project to enable data integration of preclinical studies. And she's worked at EmblyBI and Thomson Reuters. So, I'd like to add that Alexandra and Drashtti are known as the fair ladies at Bayer, and they will tell you more about that, I expect. So, welcome, panel. I'm now turning to start with James, and I will be moving the slides. So I hand over the mic to James.
Great, thank you, Ian. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Getting a nod in
yes, we can.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, I'm James Malone. I'm the CTO at SciBite. For those who don't know what SciBite is and what we do, we're a semantic technology company. So our interest in FAIR and a lot of the work we do with our clients is in helping people to apply ontologies and vocabularies built off ontologies to their data, to help them describe their data and then do something else with it ultimately. So analyze it, to produce knowledge graphs, to do machine learning, all that sort of stuff. So we have a keen interest in this. I personally have been involved in building multiple ontologies and many ontology projects. So obviously I have a bit of a background in working with metadata and open data from my job at EBI in particular. So I have a bit of an interest in this, although perhaps I'm not an expert in all of the FAIR parts. So next slide, please, Ian. So I thought, since it's always nice to start with a little bit of a story, I thought it was interesting to show something else other than biology this time, a bit of astronomy, I guess. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. There's no poll on this one. So this is the image from April the 10th from the Event Horizon telescope array that was produced by that consortium of the first image of a supermassive black hole that was taken. And I think it's an interesting one because the image itself, in some ways, encapsulates what it is we want to do. Which is put things together and produce something that is more than the sum of its parts. And having the image as the end goal is the thing that makes the news, is the thing everybody wants to see. But ultimately, on the next slide, Ian, please, it's this stuff, the bits behind it, that are the things that are really where all of the work goes into it. These are all the components that are underneath this image. So you're talking about over 200 scientists involved, so lots of people. And you can see the list on the right is the author list for the consortium that published the collection of papers along with this image. It's massive, so it's a huge amount of people involved. 60 institutes, 18 countries, telescopes from across the globe, all of which needed to work together, coordinate their data. So big, in fact, they had to actually ship some of it rather than try and use the internet, and put a lot of algorithms into crunching this data and putting it all together. Clearly, that is not possible unless you coordinate the way you're sharing all of this data together. So this is kind of a key objective of what FAIR is trying to get us towards, these sorts of projects, but ultimately the end goal. Next slide, please, Ian. So how do we equate the money we put into doing FAIR? What's the benefit of having done FAIR, or indeed having not done FAIR? So this report, I know, has done the rounds quite a lot. It's an EC commissioned report that was published in 2018. They kind of looked at the flip of this and said, well, we can probably put a figure on what FAIR looks like. What about if we don't do FAIR? What are we actually missing out on? What's the missed opportunity cost ultimately? So they have various figures that they've estimated. The big one was that there's over 10 billion euros of cost missed effectively, so missed opportunity ultimately of not doing FAIR, of not having FAIR data across the different research data that's been published. So this is across just the EU. This is just for the EU. So interesting figures. I think there's also some interesting snapshots across their various summaries that also still suggest there's barriers. A couple of big ones, which some of you perhaps already understand, is that there is clearly a real, or at least a perceived cost to doing FAIR, to making it happen. It costs time, money, and people to make these things happy. And that investment of time and money is one of the things that we need to talk about when we're thinking about how do we make things fair. Having the principles is great, but what is it that it actually costs us to get to the point where we can make our data more fair? What does that sliding scale, that spectrum of fairness actually look like? What is it we can do that's cheaper, that would help us get so far? And what does it look like as we go further into fairness to increase that? Next slide, please. And obviously, this is not just a life science thing. I don't want to dwell on this, but this is broadly across many research areas. So there's plenty of reports by Gartner saying, you know, organizations with poor data, it's costing them tens of millions of dollars too per year. So not just a life science problem, it persists across many organizations. Even those who don't open their data internally, it still costs you if you don't have good data to use. Next slide, please. So technical debt, something we're all very familiar with, I'm sure. Certainly anyone who's working in any of the bigger organizations, we're all familiar with a lot of the historic data that we have kicking about in various databases and spreadsheets and silos that we want to do something with. There's an important question we need to ask ourselves when we're thinking about how do we look at the past data and try and make that more fair, make it more usable. So doing things like retrospective manual curation, putting people onto those projects to do things like fill in missing values, annotate and curate the metadata where it exists and try and align that to standards. It's not an easy task, especially when a lot of metadata is probably missing. The data generators themselves probably aren't on the project anymore or may have left the organization. Some of the technology that was used, whether that's the actual arrays or assays themselves, whether that's the software you've been using, may no longer be supported or may well have completely moved on to something else. So there's a lot of problems we have in trying to really make that older data as fair as possible and as well described as possible. And of course, this teaches us why doing prospective FAIR, looking at the data going forward, is much more valuable than just thinking about the stuff we have in the past. Having said that, there's clearly a sweet spot, one of which is there much we can automate? Is there stuff we can do to try and get a lot of value out of a lot of the data as quickly and as efficiently as possible? These are the sort of projects we end up working on a lot of the time, where we're trying to help take large volumes of data, run that through algorithms to automatically pull out metadata that is of importance to people and help them find it and search that across an organization. So there's still sweet spots you can hit there. Again, it still takes a bit of effort, but there's still some things we can do there to improve how we use our older data. And then going forward, think about, well, what's the next step? How would we avoid this situation going forward? Next slide, please. So a difficult thing we have to budget for is serendipity. And there's many examples of where this is doing research, which is hypothesis free, has a lot of value. Clearly, hypothesis-driven research still dominates a lot of publications, but being able to explore data, put data together in somewhat arbitrary ways, and find reuse for that data is something that offers a lot of value. The CRISPR one, I think, is a good example where workers have gone on previously. Before the 1993 paper, we all kind of consider the first publication of what we consider now to be CRISPR, what we know as CRISPR, where work had been published 6 years earlier, where the repeat sequence had been accidentally cloned as part of gene sequencing, where they were targeting another gene. was kind of mentioned in the paper. And there's various blogs that talk about how the authors on the 1993 paper actually found that paper, reference it, but actually they've ended up trawling, various literature to find that. So this is still an exercise that people are looking at and saying, how can we best pull in data and reuse that for other purposes other than perhaps the original thing we were looking for, the observations we spotted that might be useful to other people, maybe they're not useful for us right now. So that's hard. That's a hard thing to do. And justifying the cost of how we put data together for things that we can't quite conceive today, again, is expensive. This is a cost that we have to bear if we want to make the data very highly reusable. But still making it broadly reusable so you can understand the data in the future should still be an objective that we have. Again, thinking about the cost benefit of where we draw that line is the important thing. Next slide, please. For a project I was involved in during my time at EBI, when we created the EBI's RDF linked data platform, our job there was really to take a lot of the data that we had and really ultimately represent the data. We had use cases, but actually we had data and we were trying to link together the data in a way that meant other people could explore the data in a slightly different way. And you can see from these diagrams, these are the actual schema diagrams from some of the RDF, actually in its second form now, second release. You can see it gets very complex very quickly. One of the objectives of FAIR, one of the principles, is to try and make the data as machine readable, amenable to processing by machines as possible. But you can see it gets very complicated when you're trying to represent biology, because ultimately the biology is complicated. And some of the things we did up front were trying to work out which bits of each different data set across 7 different groups, 7 different big databases, how do they connect together? What are the touching points where we can connect these things together? And again, that's pretty hard. It takes effort, it takes cost. Next slide, please. We had a massive advantage in what we were doing. So although we weren't very clear exactly what the use cases were we'd solve with this, we were working with well annotated FAIR data. Ultimately, FAIR, well before FAIR existed, FAIR was going on in a lot of other organizations before the acronym was released. And this is the stuff that EBI has been doing for a long time, publishing this data in an open, well-described way. So we had a massive advantage there that we could use this well annotated data, and ultimately on a small budget with a lot of coordination between people, we could produce this only because we had this good data ultimately. Next slide, please. Another cost that we have to consider is that of culture. I know this appears in quite a lot of FAIR talks recently that I've been listening to. I think I saw Rob's tweet the other day and I kind of felt a bit of sympathy for him because some of the talk people have about how we can affect cultural change and try to encourage people to do more with their data for sharing purposes. This is really hard, perhaps one of the hardest things to do, changing the culture of the way people work. Curation, and I've given many talks about this, and I'm a big advocate for the sort of curation that goes on with data and ontologies. It's always been an underfunded and underappreciated research activity, which is what it is. It is a research activity, which is not highly valued in a lot of places. But actually has a huge role to play if we're trying to get FAIR data. More value is placed in producing the data, producing summary analytics, actionable insights, etc. Pointing the way forward by saying we can give kudos for peer review in the way that we do already with things like publishing literature is almost certainly not the way to go forward, because we already know peer review is fundamentally broken, as Rob tweet alludes to here. He's got 5 papers submission, 1 is being rejected because they can't even find reviewers who will accept to review it. If we're trying to find people to curate data for us, this is going to be tough. It's a big ask, I think. So the technology which is helping us go so far is good, but what we need to do is think about how we can involve the data generators, the people involved who are actually producing the data, into the conversations when we're talking about how do we make data fairer, how do we follow these principles. And ultimately, I have a bit of a dog in this race. I'm involved in many ways, but I am certainly only one person in a much bigger story. And I feel like we should be involving more of the data generators and curators in this picture, in this story going forward. Next slide, please. And of course, there's machine learning, where obviously this wants to be an enabler of what's going on in the machine learning world at the minute with all of the advances that are going on. FAIR has a big role to play here too. So if you're doing machine learning, you will know that 80–90% of what you do is trying to get the data in a form that you can use it with algorithms before you start tweaking parameters. So doing things like the feature extraction, producing subsets, merging for your algorithms, etc. Again, it's costly exercise, takes a lot of time. So FAIR has a place here in helping us find the data in the first place and then understand what it means and how we might be able to use that and use it in these algorithms. So there's clearly an objective there. So cost-effective ways, because I'm a spendthrift, about how we might think about doing FAIR, but on a bit of a budget going forward. So I think the first thing we should talk about is the third-party vendors that we're using, that we're collaborating with. We should be asking them how they support FAIR. What is it they're doing that would support FAIR? That includes technology providers, the vendors we use to buy technology from, right through to CROs. We see a lot of data that comes in from CROs in lots of different formats. I know they're not always FAIR. I know they're not always using ontologies, etc. We should be asking them to correspond to some of those FAIR principles. Another thing would be to agree on metadata across your organization, internally at least. What's the metadata standards we want to adhere to? Communicate that. Again, that's not a big cost to do that, but will get you quite far in aligning the metadata you should be using. I mentioned involving data generators. I think that's another key thing we need to do, to bring those people into the room and have them involved in that discussion. There's increasing costs as we go down this, so ensuring things like the data is shared across an organization to share the value and demonstrate that value. This gets more expensive when we start thinking about having big data lakes and demonstrating value, but of course has a lot of value to the people using it. Funding public curation and other curation efforts should be something we think about. And having things like FAIR compatible metadata in the ELNs we use, again, we're increasing cost at this point, but these are kind of things we would need to do to make FAIR possible, right through to kind of mandating minimum metadata for people who generate the data themselves and actually have to annotate it. So my take home, I think there's a line we can draw, and the line really should be, what is it you need to describe the data in sufficient detail such that it is understandable and therefore fit to share with other people so that they can reuse it and understand it. But clearly this is a spectrum. It depends on what the biology is, what it is you're trying to describe, how you want that data to be reused in the future. There's clearly a spectrum here. What you need to think about is the kind of resolution you need so that you can actually make sense of the image at the end.
Thank you very much, James. An excellent run through from your viewpoint. Now, I just want to remind people to put questions in the questions box. That would be really good. And we'll come to a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So I'm moving on now to Filip Pattyn from OntoForce. So Filip, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Filip Pattyn. I'm the scientific lead at OntoForce. And I also would like to draw a little bit the attention on FAIR and how to deal with fairness in practice. So if you talk about FAIR, you immediately also talk about or start to think about what is the effort you have to put into it and if it's worth the money or the time you spend on it. Next slide, please. So how can you start with trying to assess the fairness of a data set? You could start with checking every principle, if a data set is fitting yes or no the principle or is fulfilling the principle, but that's a little bit difficult. Next slide. It means that you try to compare different things which are not really easily to compare. So how to deal with that is to think about fairness in another way. Next slide, please. So there was a recent publication by the team of Michel Dumontier, who is also one of the authors of the initial FAIR principles publication, where he mentioned what would be a good way to measure fairness. And one of the important things are you need to be very clear. It needs to be reproducible because otherwise it's very hard to deal with it. It's rather straightforward here, but it needs also to be discriminating so that you're able to use a measurement where you can really combine in an objective way or compare in an objective way different calculations. And so it should also be universal in the way that you could try to compare it or to use it in different in all kind of situations. Next slide, please. So if you think about that, these principles, you need to be something that is really reflecting the rationale behind FAIR. What is the main rationale is that if you produce data in a certain way that for a certain purpose that you would like to think about, okay, if I structure my information as such and make my data available as such that it could be used maybe for multiple purposes, not only for yourself, but maybe also for other people. That means if you do it for a general purpose or more general purpose, that you can also maybe benefit from other data sets which are produced in the same way. But it's very important to also think about the audience. For who are you doing this? And that means that you try to produce data in such a way that it can be used with less difficulties by other people. Next slide, please. So if you think about that, when is a data set fair or fair enough? And I think that's important here. You see a few screenshots of a thinking experiment where you say, okay, if you start, for example, like with PubMed articles, and you would like to find the affiliations of authors, they are not just structured in a way that you can nicely combine them. And I just put some slides together here, some screenshots together here to say, okay, if you have a certain publication, you maybe can, via the ORCID profile that maybe some of you know of an individual, find where someone has worked and then maybe see what the colleagues are, etc. That means I'm talking about a very concrete use case. And the problem is, if you are dealing with a certain data set, you have a certain propagation of the fairness, because if you're referring to certain vocabularies in a certain data set, that means that the vocabulary you're referring to or the information that you're using to annotate your data set should be fair too. So it's not easy. It doesn't stop with a single data set. If you talk about the fairness of a data set, it's about the use case. Next slide, please. So what the essence is of making data fair means that it's making data available, that it can be used with less effort. So this effort can be expressed as and can be quantified as a cost. It could be a cost in time, or it could be a cost in human or machine resources. And you can add a unit of measurements on that, so like a pricing. That means that it also makes it possible, if you think about how the data could be used more efficiently, that you can start to think about the return on investment. And that makes it interesting, because then you can make a distinction between, or a comparison between what is the investment that you have made and what is the output or the outcome of that. Next slide, please. So if you think about a practical application of making data fair and making it available for other people, what you can think about is, if you have different data sources, that's on the left side of the screen, you have to do potentially some transformations to make the data more fair, to make the data easier integratable, and to make it available in your application. And then ultimately you provide it via a graphical user interface or a web service to your end users. Next slide, please. All of these steps are types of effort. Producing the data, manipulating the data, storing the data, serving the data, etc. So next slide, please. If you have your data in a more fair format, it means that there is a more rapid implementation possible. That would be the goal. That means that data consumers could solve use cases that they couldn't solve before, because the number of transformation that you had to do the integration would be much too difficult, or they could solve the use cases with much less effort. And I think we have to go for that. Next slide, please. So if you think about a process of making data more fair, it could be that you have different iterations. In the first place, you maybe have to do an initial effort to make your data more fair, and then you can generate value of that first effort, and that stands for your audience, for your end users. But it could be that people come up with additional use cases, more advanced use cases, and then the investment could be even more difficult. And so you have in comparison, a bigger effort to do to have this additional value creation. But that could mean that the audience could be much bigger. So you see this, you could see this as a gradual evolvement of efforts you have to do with expanding the available use case. So you go for the low-hanging fruit or the very pragmatic approaches, but it doesn't mean that you're blocking subsequent efforts. Next slide, please. So if you think about in that way, and I'm almost on the end here, you also have some things to, okay, what is the effort you would like to do? Are you focusing on price or on time? It could be that you have some can apply some faster movements by using more skilled people to do your conversions and to prepare your data in a more fair format. Or you can rely on less expensive resources, and it maybe takes a little bit longer. That's the trade-off you have to make. Also, the trade-off between manual processing and automated processing. And for some use cases, you need a supervised way, so a combination of manual and automated. Next slide, please. So what is also important to take into mind is that with the state-of-the-art technology we have today, it will take some time to, let's say, increase the fairness of your data, existing data, new to produce data. But what we see is that there is a huge effort ongoing, and also James was referring to that with the work of SciBite, for example, and also the things we do and other companies, is that we try to provide tools and instruments which can help you in optimizing the conversion of your data into more fair data. So that means that in the future, making your data more fair could be much more rapid than what is now available today, or that you can build on the available ontologies and vocabularies which are available already to bring your data to a higher level. I think next slide, Ian, that's my last slide probably. To conclude, so I would propose that you could express fairness of a data set as a cost-based measurement, and we are actually doing this with the tooling we have. So I didn't have the time to go deeper into this, but there are some tools where we can assist you in data integration with doing this in a very effective way. So we try to approach it in a pragmatic and no over-engineered way, so that you always keep the use cases in mind. And so first, solve what you need to solve first, and then see what you can move into. We also see this if you have a cost-based measurement, that you can have a ratio scale. That means that it can be nicely compared to other calculations, and it also allows you then to think about the return on investment. And ultimately, there are still some things to consider, is the unit of cost. If you are doing this in a certain place in the world, it could be that you can produce it, or that you can do it with other means or other resources in a more effective way. So that's, in a sense, what I had to say. Thanks a lot. For any questions, you can always contact me.
Thank you, Filip. One thing I just want to make absolutely clear, of course, the Fair Metrics paper is a paper from numerous authors, not just Michel Dumontier. Likewise for the original FAIR Guidelines Principles paper, multi-authorship.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I was referring to Michel. Yeah, indeed.
Of many people, yeah. Just to make
absolutely,
that clear.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move along to Alexandra and Drashtti.
Yeah, thank you. Although the FAIR principles have been developed for the research community, we think it's equally important for the pharma industry to apply the FAIR data principles. If you go to the next slide. And why do we need FAIR in pharma? Because we want to close this gap that exists from scientific discovery until patients benefit from it in form of products and services. We all know it takes a very long time, like 10 to 15 years, to bring a drug on the market. And with all the scientific innovation that is around, still a healthcare professional has very limited times and means to find the best treatment for his patient. So he usually cannot study the individual disease pathway of each patient. So in the end, our patients, as for now, do not necessarily receive the best treatments that could be available. And we hope that with digitalization, we can change this. We have a lot more information available now on patients. We can sequence genomes. Patients measure themselves with digital devices, and we have health records available in electronic format. And also we have the computing power and algorithms available to analyze this massive amount of data. And in this, we hope to overcome this gap towards better translational medicine. And at the heart of all of this is machine-readable data, and that's why we need FAIR also for pharma. If you go to the next. So James already introduced the same article, cost of not having FAIR. Again, this was calculated for research data, but research is a key driver for innovation also in the pharma industry. So I just picked some topics from the paper that are also important for the pharma industry and the impact FAIR data has on research activities, collaboration and innovation. And here, yeah, I cannot stress more that our data scientists nowadays spend most of the time in data pre-processing and data integration. And we also spend a lot of money on licenses to buy data from data providers, like from patient registries. And also we buy a lot of data that we then have to process in-house to integrate it and yeah, analyze it. And if the data was fair from the beginning, we could save a lot of money and time on that. And what also struck me was that there's a considerable amount of costs in storage because of duplication of data present in all our siloed repositories we have. Yeah, and for collaboration, sometimes if we cannot exchange our research results, we do redundant research, and maybe we miss opportunities because we are not always clear about the data usage conditions. So if we can do a certain research on data or not. If we go to the next slide. So what we are almost often asked by the management is, how much does it cost now to make all our R&D data fair? And when are we done with it? And as also, yeah, the speakers pointed out,
it really depends on the use case, right?
Yes, exactly. So just to make data fair for the sake of it does not necessarily bring the value we are expecting. So we have to face that it will cost a lot to make our data fair. So we have to stay very focused and focus on where we think we create most value. So we have to look at where are our most important business decisions made and which data provides us the evidence for it. And we should start with this data to make it fair. And so we have to invest in our legacy data, and also, as James has pointed out in the beginning, also in the data generation. So we should start with collecting fair data so that we don't have to make it fair in a later stage. And for the question, when are we done with it? Well, as long as we innovate, we will never be done with it. And we have to understand it's not a one-time investment we do, but we have to create a fair ecosystem that sustainably and in an ongoing way will provide this fair data. And also we have to invest into creating awareness and educate our people. We have to change the mindset. So people have to buy into this idea of sharing their data, and we have to think of means of incentivizing people doing it. So just a few more words on the fair ecosystem on the next slide. Yeah, this was also an interesting publication from the European Commission on the Fair Action Plan, where they give a lot of recommendations how to make data fair. And the fair ecosystem contains the fair digital objects. So here it's not only focusing on data, but in general, any digital resource should be made fair. So this includes also software, APIs, even licensing contracts, protocols. And then the fair services are around anything of the data lifecycle management, from the generation of data until long-term preservation. And important fair components are centering around people, processes, and infrastructure. And we need to invest into skills, set up policies that regulate the way we develop the fair ecosystem, and things like standards, metrics to measure fair, persistent identifiers, and so on. And on the next slide, just to show what kind of skills are needed. And now I would like to hand over to Drashtti to give some examples of benefits of FAIR.
Thank you, Alexandra. Ian, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to talk about the benefits of the FAIR data, and I'd like to take I was really impressed by the way the EU Commission wrote regarding the PwC report on what are the cost and benefits analysis of the research data. And it obviously took the research data activity, the life cycle of what it is, and I said, why can't we do something similar for the pharma data as well? So if you have to start with data analysis, so basically they really benefit out of FAIR data because now they do not have to do no more data hunting, and as previously mentioned, it really takes up like 80% of their time. And then they generate certain insights, which are taken up by these researchers, who then have evidence-based hypotheses, and then that leads to innovation. And then in the process, the preclinical development happens where the toxicologists and the safety pharmacologists can really benefit on improved dose prediction because they now have better model comparisons to make. And through that better prediction, we have the study team that comes into the play, which can now design a more optimal clinical trial. And basically, that can help in patient stratification, and that leads to reduced trial length. Finally, it leads to then the patient that get the drugs, and that leads to early market access. And all of this basically helps us to reduce the cost, which brings benefit to the pharma industry. Also, I would like to highlight here that sometimes you only focus making data fair for R&D, but actually it's across the entire value chain of pharmaceutical company. And that also means that marketing, sales, product supply can also greatly benefit from fair data as well. Next slide, please. So in the next 3 slides, I'm going to take 3 case study. The first one is internal, which is Pattyn, which is basically a platform where we can access clinical biomarker and biosample data. But this is only from bio-sponsored interventional and non-interventional clinical trials. And this was really a game changer within bio because it got one-point access to all these kinds of data. It was semantically integrated, and most importantly, it really handled the data privacy questions and the informed consent. So now they are machine readable as well, and people know how to use and reuse it as well. It is definitely agnostic to data sources, the types of the variety of data owners, and it really enables scientists to do cross-study analysis. And that actually we have a real outcome of it. There was reduced in FTEs. We had less amount of now people over the course of the project who were doing who were just involved in data cleansing. Now that the data is fair more or less from the source that is trying to be impacted, we have reduced FTEs. We definitely also had some insights generated, and overall there was also savings on the hardware costs. And right now that particular compound is in phase 2, and we've already saved around 3 million euros per annum. And if it passes phase 3, we're having a predicted profit of 350 million euros. And just to know that for every month that is saved, for every compound that goes early into the market, it's around 80 million euros, sorry, for the month. So that was one case study where we actually have hard figures on the table. In the second case study, Ian, I would like to take the example of the eTox project, which was held by IMI, and that project ended in December 2018. This again was one of the key breaking projects where groundbreaking projects, sorry, to share where pharmaceuticals companies share the data on toxicity of drug-like compounds. Definitely, it was not fulfilling all the principles of FAIR, but I think in terms of findability and accessibility, this was definitely a huge step. And this is now one of the projects where the data sets will be considered for the IMI FAIR Plus initiative as well. But even now, if you look at the predicted, this was from the McKinsey report where they predicted what is the overall impact for such a database to be there. They've expected like 82 million euros, which I think is a big sum for us to consider. And there were many publications, and there were many leads generated as well. And I think that is the real benefit of such a project as well. Last but not the least, my third case study was on the IMR Economy project as well. Here, I do not have like hard numbers for sure, but I have more of the other values attached to it. This project was to seek molecular characteristics of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And basically now you have the knowledge base where they've already identified groups of patients that differ significantly from each other. They also showed us how there's more information and new information for both the disease. New disease models were created. We can now go and evaluate our new data mining approaches, and we can also validate some mechanistic disease hypotheses as well. And I think all of these three case studies really show the power behind making your data fair, because this project especially was based on the FAIR principles as well. So now on my last slide, I would just like to summarize. We definitely would like to echo the first 2 points that were also in the report, that research is a key driver for productivity and economic growth. It doesn't make sense if there is redundant research. We really saw the value when there is collaboration, especially between the public and private side, because that led to costs where we really saved on costs on time, storage, and license fees, because there was shared infrastructure in that case. The report also suggested that the cost on time, storage, and license can be actually brought down to almost zero if you really make the data fair. A sustainable, fair ecosystem, as even I think James pointed out in his machine learning thing, that it's really the foundation for advanced data analytics and AI. Within the pharma industry, we can definitely say a change in mindset is a battle half won, because most of the time and effort is really spent on changing this mindset. And data and service providers need to be part of this change, because that's the key. And last but not the least, at the end of the day, I think it puts the patient in the center if you implement these FAIR principles. So that's about it from our end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drashtti and Alexandra. So, we've heard from our expert panel, and now it is time to turn to you, the audience, for our questions and answer session. We've got a good 10 minutes available, so please make full use of the questions box, which is on the GoToWebinar platform panel.
So Ian, so one of the questions that has come up in general, just with all of our webinars, is how can you get this information? I have put the link again in the chat box. The slides and the recording will be posted on our webinar page probably Monday or Tuesday, and so all of this will be available. We have several questions that you might want to follow up on. Could you repeat again the EU report? And I'm not. I think many of you have referred to it again. What was the title of that again? And maybe we'll put that in the chat box right away, because it sounds like a number of people are very interested in that.
Yeah. So yes, that's the report from PricewaterhouseCoopers. So
yeah, I mean, maybe you can go back to that slide and just
let me whiz back
so that we can see that. While you're doing that,
here it is. So yeah, you can find it through Google, of course. Cost of not having fair research data is the title of the report from PricewaterhouseCoopers. The URI is down at the bottom of the slide, and it's the European Commission. It was Commission, the European Commission sponsored the report from PricewaterhouseCoopers.
So we have a question about what kinds of technology, are semantic technologies really the best approach to achieve FAIR, or what other approaches might be possible?
So panel, did you catch that question? Who would like to pick up that question that Carmen just posed?
Yeah, so maybe from our side at Bayer, yes, we decided to go for semantic technologies because it's an open standard and broadly applied in, I mean, at least the internet. So we think it's a good foundation for the fair data principles.
Yeah, I'd echo exactly what Alexandra said as well. I think it kind of depends what you mean by semantic technology in this context. I guess there's the technology for applying things like ontologies or some flavor of ontologies or schema or whatever to the data. That's the one part of it. And then there's the actual semantic models themselves, often they're ontologies. Clearly, we use a lot of those publicly available ontologies. We do extra things to use them in the sort of text mining we do. But we certainly use and endorse those sorts of public standards for the reasons we outlined. You want to try and attach your data to common standards so that it's most reusable across other data sets, especially those in the public domain that you might want to reuse, as well as within your organization, and actually increasingly across different organizations as well. So between a lot of pharmaceutical companies now collaborate with other pharmaceutical companies too. So you kind of want those common standards so you can share the data across it, and clearly semantic approaches have a big part to play there.
Thank you, James. I see there's a question specifically on, a couple of questions on eTox. So this one is for Drashtti and Alexandra, because you're pretty close to that IMI project. So the questions are, how much of the eTox data is publicly available, and is it being shared in a fair way? Are the two questions related to each other? What would you say?
So I would say the eTox with the IMI is a consortium definitely where public and private have come together. If I'm not mistaken, there is some, I don't know if it's accessible to everyone. To be honest, it's there is some data which is private, and then there is some data which is shared across the consortium. But I think you have to be part of the consortium to be able to actually take the pick the benefits of having this eTox database. And I think that is another myth that I would really like to burst. The making data fair does not mean making data open. And so it is having the right accessibility in order to even have that data available. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. I think the open aspect of FAIR are the communication protocols should be open, based on open standards, but the actual data, for all sorts of reasons, it could be confidentiality, it could be intellectual property, could well be closed. Okay, have you got any more questions, Carmen, that you've managed to spot?
Well, yeah. So so one of them is, I actually like this question. If you were starting from scratch today on a global disease registry, what would you sort of feel the 3 key learnings are to implement that? Is there some thoughts on? There's a lot we talk about the retrospective stuff, but
so let's ask Filip. Maybe you could have a go at that one to start off with, and then the others can chip in. What do you think about that question, Filip?
Could you just repeat the question, please?
If you were starting out, where to begin with, verifying your data sets?
Well, so yeah, so the example was here. If you were going to do a global disease registry, what would you learn? What would you have learned from past experience?
Well, there are some things which are, let's say, straightforward in certain use cases. For example, if you have a global disease registry, that you, for example, start with encoding the diseases in something which is generally accepted, which is generally recognized. For example, like SNOMED CT or MEDRA codes or ICD-10 codes, etc. Why then? Because you try to avoid that you're missing out on synonym terms, misspellings, etc. So that could be the beginning. But how we see it is that you start with initial use cases. If you say, okay, if you have a global registry, what are the main use cases you would like to start with? So what is a pragmatic approach to first deliver this and then see how it can grow?
I suspect James definitely would echo that sentiment about everything should be application driven. That's where you start.
Yeah, absolutely. disease is a really interesting one, actually, in a lot of ways, because it's kind of one of the areas where the metadata standards are very varied, and there are multiple. And actually, that kind of, as you know in yourself, the mapping between disease metadata standards is still a bit of a challenge, and a bit of an open challenge in a lot of ways. I think I can tell you from the perspective of what we've done when I was at EBI, and actually what we do at SciBite is we basically pick one. And we take bits of others if we need to extend it, but we've basically picked one and we stick to that one consistently, which means we kind of have our standard. So we're not stuck with, here's 10 different flavors of 10 different disease ontologies, which one do you want? Because that way can be madness, I think. So I think I mentioned this, I think, when I was talking before. I think at least agreeing within your organization or within your consortium, if this is a project you're talking about, what is it we're going to do with the disease annotations? Let's pick a standard and let's try and stick to that.
Thank you, James.
So here's another question. The idea of, has anyone, so these case studies are excellent. In fact, that comes up several times. So definitely thank you, Debar, for sharing those. But has anyone estimated the cost of making the R&D data fair?
So like I said, give you the bio perspective. I do not have hard fact numbers on other pharmaceutical companies for sure. We did reach out to them, but unfortunately it was not possible for us to get the numbers. But I would suspect that it's not really far away from the numbers that we have in-house. And again, this is a very, very conservative number, right? Because we're literally looking at one compound that was useful from the system, but there could be, it really depends on each year how many targets did we actually were able to be successful about, and what is the market share about the same. So on an average, more or less is the figures that I gave you.
Yeah. Okay. Here we have another question on. That often one of the challenges with FAIR data is that the user or the collector of the data, of the initial data, is not necessarily the future user. They're repurposing and other ideas. Do you have some thoughts on how to sort of incentivize the capturers of data to maybe capture beyond what they need in the instance? Is there anything we can do as a community that gives a benefit for that?
I can take that question. Yeah. Yes. So one of the important things is that you give immediate or on a very short time scale immediate satisfaction also to the people who are providing the FAIR data. That means that you need to be able to give them something back if they do the effort of time investment in making data fair, which means that they should be able to work more efficiently also with the data they produce. So one of the things could be, typically if you are thinking in R&D, like data which is coming out of an experimental setup, that the data is not only be handled, for example, in the typical way they use, like in Excel or something like that you are manipulating the data, that you really can bring it to another level with more automation immediately, also for the people who are producing the data. Okay.
Yep.
We think also it should be more appreciated by the managers, so they should also incentivize people for spending time on data curation. And also we think that the citation of people contributing to it, that should include the data generators, and that could also be a nice incentive to be mentioned in the outcomes then as one of the contributors.
And I understand, Alexandra, that the bring your own data workshop sessions that you run within Bayer are a very useful approach to engage with the users, to convince them that this really is great value.
And it's important to bring together, I think, the people, the generators and the users, so that they start a conversation, understand each other, and also looking at your own data, you understand the FAIR data principles and understand the advantage also of having FAIR data.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to finish this webinar telling you, pointing to the next webinar, which is going to be the Pistoia Alliance AI Centre of Excellence webinar, Data for AI Models, the Past, the Present and the Future, which is on Thursday, the 6th of June at 11 AM EST, 4 PM GMT, so it says. I suspect that might even be BST, but you never know.
It's supposed to be, sorry, my fault, BST.
Yeah, BST, that is, okay. So, and Professor John Overington from Medicine's Discovery Catapult, a friend to many here on the line, will be presenting on that. So that should be really interesting. So I'd encourage everybody to register for that. So with that, I would like to draw the webinar to a close, thanking our expert panel for their contributions, their really interesting presentations, and the really vibrant Q&A session that you, the audience, brought to this webinar, which I found really interesting. So thank you, everybody. I would like to draw this webinar to a close.